So when you think about the rational self, they want to make sense of everything and piece together the dots.
Yes.
But it seems like that would take away the power and purpose of the spiritual self that's more faith-driven, correct? Where there's not always an answer for everything that's happening, or am I not processing that?
Oh,
So let's talk a
definitely.
little bit
For
about
sure,
the spiritual self.
the spiritual self will definitely come in where, especially as Christians, where we understand this level of what is faith. Because faith, God does not always make sense.
Okay.
So that part of us, if it has a significant amount of power in the relationship within ourselves, it will know how to manage the rational self and say everything does not have to make sense. Because you can walk away from relationships. I have truly, and I've seen them in my office, to where they went a third time and it still didn't connect with the other person. And so you don't have, it's not a requirement that you understand.
Mm-hmm.
If your rational self is, you have to understand. If that's the standard that you have within yourself, is I have to understand. No, you don't.
Right.
Have to understand everything.
Right.
So you can only do your part, especially when you're talking about another person. When you've done what you need to do, is that lay that aside and say, I don't have to understand why this person will not change their behavior. That's when we can start getting into the overthinking and, well, I went to him and when we're trying to make it about, I am going to understand. Well, then that's where the problem comes in. And we need to draw a boundary, first of all, within ourselves, is that how many times am I going to give it before I can let go without understanding?
Wow.
Right.
That's powerful. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the spiritual self, are there any cons or anything we need to be mindful of when we think about that? Like keeping it in balance or in harmony with the other two components?
Sure. Definitely. So faith, we know that faith does not always make sense. Mm-hmm. You know, serving God does not always make sense. The thing about the team, the ego, the rational self, and the spiritual self is you can't separate them. They're three in one. They just provide different functions in your life.
Okay.
So even though they have different functions, different likes, they all, inside of us, they still are all pretty much observing the same thing. We get to decide to say, okay, my spiritual self need to be involved in this decision, or my spiritual self need to be involved in this relationship, because it brings an element of self-control. It brings an element about behavior that doesn't necessarily have to be about the other person. It's I need to do what I need to do to create peace within myself, whether I created peace there or not. Because we can only do so much about the other person. Mm-hmm. But we've been called as faith-based people to have self-control over our own self.
Yes, but also when we think about that, as we grow in our spiritual self, I've even struggled with this, and I know other people have, is that they try to diminish the ego, because it seems that this spiritual, peaceful component within us now feels completely different when that ego rises up when someone has disrespected us.
Right.
And now we want to respond in what feels natural or out of flesh. We do that, then we feel bad, we take a step back. How can these two components coexist without us denying ourselves? We want to be authentic.
Yes.
So we grow in our spiritual selves. How do we still honor the ego in that same situation?
So it's being able to recognize that, number one, is that before we became Christians or before we became spiritual people, the rational self and the ego worked together for a long time. So in Romans 5:8, he talks about when we were just straight up in our ego and in our rational self, Christ found us valuable, even when we was at our worst. So when we bring in the spiritual component of that part of us is designed to have a direct link to God, to be able to have that part of us or that perspective presented. So when the ego stands up, it's like, okay, does my ego have a valid point?
Okay, so even though I'm a spiritual person, I'm a faith-based person, someone disrespects me, you're saying that I should pause and say, before I shut my ego out, say, yes, does she have a right to respond in this situation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But it's how we respond.
That's the key.
Okay.
It's how will I allow my ego to respond in this situation? Is it going to be where I just let her run rampant
Okay.
and do damage? Because that's what she naturally does. The ego naturally goes towards some form of destruction.
Unless it's controlled and
Unless
managed.
it's controlled and managed.
Wow.
And so that's where the spiritual self comes in. And so I call it having a round table moment. I take a pause. Because you can, typically you can feel when the ego starts to rise. And at that moment, I go, okay, so let me listen. And does my ego have a valid point? And I go, okay, so yes, she does have a valid point. Because it's only so much that my ego is going to take. She's not going to allow me to be disrespected.
Right.
That's the part.
Right.
So she's going to stand up, and I get to decide as the born again self, okay, how are we going to present this? Okay, you can respond, but how you respond is what I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
So, yes.
See, what I love about this is even when we grow in our faith and our spiritual self and peace and, we're just in this space where we don't have to understand everything.
Right.
But our natural emotions as a human being, if we are disrespected, we don't have to deny our truth. We don't have to deny our ego. But I think many times we've tried to suppress it and say, I've changed. I'm this new person. Yes. And then we're disappointed when the triggers come up and we lash out. We're disappointed in ourselves and we think we have to go and ask forgiveness because we were honoring our truth.
Right.
And we get afraid to respond in our truth because we've created damage in the past. So what I hear is as we grow and accept our truth, we can still honor that we want to respond. It's how we respond to ensure we don't create damage, but we don't deny ourselves.
Exactly.
So if you're walking into a situation that is disrespectful, although you're saved, although you're faith-based, although you're a peaceful person, you can still address that this was unacceptable.
Yes.
And you can do that in a respectful manner rather than a way that's creating damage.
Right.
So that's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I love it. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And even with the rational self, is that for us to understand who we are, is that when you're in a situation, let's say you're in a relationship and it doesn't make sense. Why does this person keep talking to me a certain way? And of course, the ego is going to rise up and, consider that to be disrespectful. And the rational self is going to want to make sense of it. And so the spiritual self can come in because it's going to hear from the perspective of scripture and come in and say, okay, so how do we need to address this? It's okay to pause, even if it's just for a brief moment. It's how do I want to respond in such a way that I'm not burning bridges, that I want to stay in control, or I can say, here's a boundary that, and I call it, I can change the nature of the relationship.
Yeah.
Or I can do control or delete. I call that as well, which means for me is that I need to shift. If that person does not want to change, then I need to shift on how I conduct myself in this relationship by laying healthy boundaries. I know this person doesn't want to change. That means I take the responsibility of changing the nature of the relationship.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Today's segment has been brought to you by our sponsors, The Essence of Excellence, ACT Score Booster, and MarriagesCanWin.com. Be sure to subscribe to Tierra Destiny and Friends via YouTube and enter your email address at TierraDestinyRead.com for more updates, free online training, and details on our next live taping.